Hello, my lovelies. It's Andrea Edwards, and welcome back to part two. Yep, we're still in part two of We Need a New Middle Class Dream. And this is section 7, The Business of War. This was a pretty intense one to do, I have to admit. We're all seeing what's going on around the world and the rising escalations. And the impact on our biosphere is something that really needs to be addressed. We can't afford war. We never could afford war, but now we really, really can't afford war. All right, let's talk about war. The business of war. So I want to start by stating that I do not consider myself a pacifist. I'm not pro-war, but I'm not a pacifist, because I know that the world that we live in means that there is an inevitability of war. With that said, I am definitely for peace, especially today. War is not a path that we can afford anymore. It's just as simple as that. Across my lifetime, so I was born on the 1st of January 1970, so there's been a fair bit since then, the war we have seen has not always been declared with the right intentions. And it's often driven by greed, which war typically is, or politicians lying to start wars. And obviously the Iraq War is a classic example of that. So just in case you think, well, what the hell does she know what she's talking about when it comes to war or the defence industry? I was a member of the Australian Army in the 90s, early 90s, and it gave me a very, very insight into how the military works. Of course, some will say, well, you're only a musician, but anyone who knows the military knows all roles are part of the war machine. After the Army, I joined an aerospace company. It was called Aerospace Technologies of Australia. It was an amazing job. I loved it. And that's a company that's now owned by Boeing. And again, that experience, I gained an amazing amount of insight into the defence industry as a whole. I mean, if you ever go to an air show, and I love to go to air shows, but if you go, you'll see that the majority of the air show is actually the business of war, not commercial aviation. So because of all of these early experiences, I have always followed the defence industry very, very carefully because it fascinates me, but also because I believe it's a very important industry to understand in the mix of how the world runs, right? But today, in the mix of the polycrisis, I think it's even more important that we pay attention to this industry. So where are we today? Well, unfortunately, right now, we have more war and conflict happening than we had before World War II. We can't afford war. We never could. But today, we really cannot afford war. Global cooperation on a scale never seen before is what is required of us all right now. And if we don't get this message, how can we possibly overcome the massive environmental issues we face? The rise of authoritarianism is another really huge concern. The decline of democracies as well. We only have 20% of the world's countries considered democracies today. And then add to that the burden of a changing climate and all it entails, including its impact on populations everywhere. And all those three things together means that we are facing a very grave risk here. Those with common sense and steady hearts need to lead, or we will not prevail. So when you go back through history and ask the question, why did wars start? It's typically about economic gain, territorial gain, religion, nationalism, civil war, and political revolution. I would add ego, revenge, scapegoating, and I'm sure we could add many more. Of course, wars also help politicians win elections. Just think back to the Falklands War and Margaret Thatcher. They have always been used in this way. We can't afford that anymore. However, we're also adding new reasons to go to war, which will make the future even more challenging than it already is. The reasons for these wars include water shortages, famine, extreme heat, all the way through to the burden of climate refugees. This has already begun, and we are only seeing the beginning of this. The most important question we should be asking is, how do we prepare so we don't need to go to war? because if we head towards violence, the future looks very bleak indeed. We are already on this dystopian path. Let's pull back from the brink while we still can. It's not too late, but that means all of us have to stand up and say, no more, no wars. So where are all the wars and conflicts today? Here's a list I picked up from World Population Review, which categorizes war and conflict by numbers of deaths. There are, of course, many more regions of the world in conflict, but these are the main ones when cross-checking other sources too. So it sort of gives you a sense of what's going on out there in the world. And for the visual learners, here's what that looks like on a map. And of course, this is it from 2022. It's a changing map, that's for sure. But you can see the scale of war and conflict here, where the blue is no conflict and the light orange is yes for conflict. We can't let this continue to spread. We really, really can't. So what does all of this look like on a monetary scale? Here's the military industrial complex. I would have expected more slumps based on how our politicians have been speaking over the last few decades, but it went from 262 billion in 1977 to 2.21 trillion in 2020. Apparently, global military spending increased about 9% in 2023 to 2024, with Russia, Ukraine, and the Israel-Palestine conflict both contributing to massive increases in military spending, which of course makes sense. As far as the growth is concerned, between the end of the 70s and the early 20s, it's 8,331% growth. The defence industry and its shareholders will certainly be rubbing their hands together. Here's another growth sector in the defence landscape. As you may have noticed, a feature of modern warfare we have seen grow dramatically in the past 2 years is drones. Well, here's growth predictions, and this is just for the anti-drone component, and that's 1,100% growth. Pretty amazing, huh? We probably couldn't get a full picture of the whole drone industry as far as a growth perspective goes, and I'm not sure Iran or North Korea, who are reportedly supplying drones to Russia, would be included in the public figures. So, I mean, let's be honest, who knows what those two countries are up to right now? Regardless, it's just another sector experiencing massive growth. To break it down a little more, here's how nations spend on military, and this is from 2021. Since then, Russia has moved into third place and pushed India down to fourth place. Let's have a look at India, because this graph is from Business Today India, and the country spent 76.6 billion in military spending in 2021, which was the third highest in the world at the time, following the US at 801 billion and China's 293 billion. India's military spending was up by 0.9% from 2020 and 33% from 2012. 64% of capital outlays in the Indian military budget of 2021 was earmarked for acquisitions of domestically produced arms in a push to strengthen the local arms industry. Globally, the US, China, India, the UK, and Russia were the top spenders, accounting for 62% of the global expenditure, and overall, military spending increased for the 7th consecutive year. To give a sense of growth across just a sample of countries referenced in this article, so China increased 4.7% compared with 2020, and that amounts to an increase for 27 consecutive years. The UK is up 3% from 2020. Japan saw an increase in spending of 7.3%, the highest since 1972. Australia increased its military spending by 4%. Qatar saw an increase of 434% from 2010, which is the last time it released its military spending data. And Nigeria increased its military spending by 56% in 2021, reaching $4.5 billion. So essentially, it's all going up, which is not good for the world and a sign of the tensions that exist. We need to address the tension before it gets out of hand. However, of course, no country comes even close to the US, which spent $801 billion, which was actually a drop of 1.4% from 2020. Its expenditure decreased from 3.7% of GDP to 3.5% of GDP. However, in 2024, the US president's budget requested DoD military activities, $863.5 billion, atomic energy defense, $35.1 billion, and other defense-related activities at $12.1 billion. Together, that's $910 billion or $911 billion, so it's inching up towards the $1 trillion mark. Especially as the US military alone is a monster for emissions, and the US military's carbon footprint is enormous. If you didn't know, the US Department of Defense is the largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels in the world and the largest institutional emitter. It is one of the largest polluters in history, consuming more liquid fuels and emitting more climate-changing gases than most medium-sized countries. In fact, if the US military were a country, its fuel usage alone would make it the 47th largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world, sitting between Peru and Portugal. And of course, its emissions are beyond just that. The US military has long understood that it isn't immune from the potential consequences of climate change, recognizing it as a threat multiplier that can exacerbate other risks. So when American politicians continue to argue about whether or not climate change is real, the military is getting on with the work to protect its global assets from the impact of extreme weather events and rising sea levels. So maybe to the American voting public, believe them, whatever your political association. We actually know very, very little about military emissions right across the world, and that's because it's not required to report its emissions to the United Nations. The US can take the credit for that. In 1997, its negotiating team won a blanket military exemption under the Kyoto Climate Accord, so no military anywhere on the planet had to report its emissions. In 2015, we saw the Paris Agreement remove Kyoto's military exemption, but it left military emissions reporting voluntary. There's far too many voluntary requirements in these agreements. Today, the dire state of global military emissions reporting remains dire. Underreporting is the norm, as is data that is inaccessible or aggregated with non-military sources. So a couple of examples include reporting military flights under general transport or energy for bases under commercial institutional emissions. The obvious conclusion is the only way we can shrink this enormous emissions beast is to fight for peace, and that means less military, not more. That is certainly not the direction we are going in at all, as we can all see. It's all grow, grow, grow. And if you want to push humanity well beyond the ecological tipping points, well, this is certainly going to guarantee it. That's also one of the reasons why I say no politician should be allowed to lead if they believe in end of times religious thought. We don't need anyone enthusiastically wanting that to happen, so please be aware of who you vote for. We need agents of peace, not agents of war, and unfortunately the latter are getting voted in record numbers. Right now, we're not heading towards peace, we're getting ready for war, as we can see in some of these recent headlines. From Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, warning that Europe is in a pre-war era and Ukraine must not be defeated by Russia for the good of the whole continent. Or the Serbian President, Alexander Vučić, a Putin ally, who posted on social media about an unspecified threat to his country, which has been reported as, "We will go to war in Kosovo at a time of our choosing." Yeah, that's really what the world needs right now, Vučić. The ongoing threat assessment of a war between the US and China, which is keeping everyone on tenterhooks, but we can never afford a war of this scale. It would be the end of humanity, no doubt in my books at all, and I know the majority of people will agree with me. I definitely recommend this series of articles by David Grover on Medium. Of course, many believe that World War III has already started, predominantly an information war, and I've definitely seen that, but we are all watching it evolve in real time. This is a great article by Julian Cribb in Pearls and Irritations, and I definitely recommend reading it. In fact, these 5 articles I'll put in the show notes. And then another final example, and there's many, many more, and there's just another one that came out yesterday, and it was talking about the return of national service and conscription in Europe. And I can see that happening too. But this one, in the UK, former defence and security chiefs have said the army must prepare genuinely for war to credibly deter threats. The group said a hollowing out of the regular army and reserves over the years must be reversed, warning the size of the force may already be beneath national critical mass. Now, considering it's one of the top 5 spenders on the military, it's amazing that the UK is sitting in that position. But one thing I would definitely say for all of us is get prepared for a return of national service and conscription if we keep heading in this direction. And if you're a parent of children who are old enough to be part of this, it's a pretty alarming reality, right? War has many, many, many impacts, and it results in the destruction of homes and hospitals, transportation networks and farmland, energy and civilian nuclear facilities, drinking water and wastewater systems, chemical and steel plants, mining facilities, and vital seed banks. And it's not just during the war that this matters, it poses humanitarian and environmental consequences long after the guns and missile launchers fall silent. To illustrate this, here's some headlines over the last 12 months or so that illustrate the long-term implications of war. War devastates the environment and the biodiversity contained in it, and it's not just during war, but long after the fact, as you can see with headlines on Afghanistan and Iraq. The Western alliances that led those wars, fronted by the US, have left behind absolute devastation, a sickened environment, and the casualties of those wars are still being counted. In Ukraine, in Palestine, the environmental impact is happening in real time, and one of the biggest issues not being discussed is happening right now in Palestine. Currently facing famine and death, for those who survived through this time, how will they survive the record heat that will land when the summer arrives? Those tents are not going to cut it in those heat extremes. How are we going to prepare for that? When are we going to start thinking ahead? This is a real frustration for me. I really want to emphasize this point. So what does war bring to our world? Well, obviously, untold human suffering is number one on all people, including the soldiers, civilians, with women and children at highest risk, including sexual violence and slavery. Direct impacts on habitats and species, because of course, all conservation is suspended during war. It's not high on the priority list. Pollution of air, land, and water, which goes beyond war and kills millions for years or even decades after hostilities cease. Large-scale military vehicles, explosions, and fire damages habitats inside and outside protected areas because, as we are seeing, there is no respect for the people, let alone for the land. Long-term soil and groundwater pollution, including asbestos, metal, and combustion products. Another issue that goes well beyond war. Think of the poisoned aquifers in Gaza. This is a massive long-term issue for the people living there. Nuclear plant failure releases debris and radiation, which can spread thousands of miles and cause illnesses like thyroid cancer. In Ukraine, this is a huge issue and threat. Old retired coal mines are no longer kept clean because the workers are at war or they have already died. This means heavy metals like mercury, lead, and arsenic are released into drinking and agricultural water, which has long-term consequences. The use of depleted uranium in weapons kills beyond the war, with leukemia and lymphoma spikes. In Iraq and Afghanistan, this has been a long-term issue, not just for the people left behind in the country, but also for the soldiers who go home. The bombing of energy and industrial plants releases mercury, dioxin, ammonia, heavy metals, and hydrocarbons into the environment. All are carcinogenic. And again, this is a long-term issue. Already depleted environments move towards total collapse, both ecosystem collapse and extinction events. Many of the countries at war today were already in bad shape ecologically, and this could tip them over the edge. And while there are more to include, another issue is long-term illness from all of the toxins in the environment, including in the water, but also famine, because its agriculture has been destroyed or poisoned. In Ukraine, due to the massive dam bursting, landmines were flushed across the region, making it a risk to farmers. In Palestine, their farms are being completely destroyed and poisoned. So how and when can the Palestinians feed themselves? It really is barbaric what we're willing to do to each other, don't you think? So, what are our options here? And look, I know that this all feels hopeless, but the truth is the only way we can stop this escalating is for all of us to stand up and say no to war. It really is time to speak up, protest, and show up. That means we don't need thousands on the streets or even hundreds of thousands on the streets. We need millions out marching every day to get the message across. No more war. Let's mobilize. We cannot afford to escalate. We cannot afford war at this point for humanity's sake. We just can't. Number two, please don't vote for leaders who are pushing for war. Vote for leaders who are committed to peace and diplomacy. We cannot afford war. So any leader pushing in that direction is a threat to all life on this planet. But we must also remember that there are many complexities behind war. So keeping an open mind is really, really critical. Number three, we must push for a renewed non-proliferation treaty on nuclear weapons. This treaty was first signed in 1970, and it was a landmark international treaty with the objective to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and weapons technology while promoting cooperation in the peaceful use of nuclear energy and to further the goal of achieving nuclear disarmament and general and complete disarmament. Number four, the defense industry must start shrinking dramatically. And like all other industries I've mentioned so far, and we'll cover in the next few videos, this is a huge challenge. No industry wants to lose its place in the game of power and world dominance, especially in this case, but it really is time for this beast of destruction to start diminishing, but it's never going to go away. We know that. We need to be realistic. Number five, we need to get creative and much bolder to end wars faster. Our hesitance to act strongly against tyrants is putting us where we are today. We have to act more decisively and aggressively towards any country or person who threatens the health of the entire world. It's been happening for too long, but now it's become a catastrophic risk to all of us. Number six, there are no simple solutions, only complex ones. And that makes it very challenging to overcome or even understand. Many commentators are not seeing the whole picture, which means people are latching onto sides or hating the other, because we need to simplify everything in this world today. None of this is simple, none of it. And the reason any war starts is complex, and it often goes back hundreds or even thousands of years in our history. So let's look at it all with clearer eyes and end this madness at the source of where it started, even if that was thousands of years ago. No one benefits here, no one. There are no winners in war, especially today. Number seven, the collapse of our biosphere is the greatest risk of war. As the food runs out, or access to clean water, or extreme weather events continue to destroy where we live, or all of the other risks in our future, war appears to be the inevitable outcome. But is it inevitable? Or can we understand this risk and start planning for that future versus running headlong into more war and definite collapse of our societies and biosphere? It's a decision we've got to make. We really do. War isn't the path forward. And number 8, it's time for new global leadership, cooperation, collaboration, diplomacy, and beyond. If we continue to allow war to escalate, our future will be one of extensive suffering for all people on Earth, not just those involved in the war. It has to end. Rethinking war and peace. So this is the what can you and I do part. Number 1, without question, is we must vote for peace. And we must hold our leaders accountable for peace as well. However, this is really important. We've got to stop being armchair critics, especially when our leaders are forced into a corner during war, which is just prevalent everywhere today. It happens a lot, and it's happening right now because none of this is simple. It's really, really complex. We need to see the nuance underneath the sensational media headlines, and we're not very good at doing that. Number 3, we must not go down the authoritarian path. This is the path to the expansion of war, no matter what they promise. No strong man or strong woman is coming to save us. So please help in the fight to stop the expansion of authoritarianism, because it is winning more and more now, and that will guarantee more war. Please do not vote for authoritarian leadership. They cannot deliver their promises. They cannot, not at this time, not at this time for the world. Number 4, educate, 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 read wide, read both sides, pay attention to the left and the right, hear all opinions, stand back, be objective, read the history of complex war so you can understand why we are here. We need to be much better informed, and that requires commitment, attention, and I'm sorry, time. This isn't a soundbite. Soundbites will not educate you. We need to spend time with the information that matters. It's never been more important. We've got to stop other things that we're doing to focus on this, but we need to educate ourselves. It's very, very important. I really believe that. Number 5, if you are an expert and you're not speaking up, please speak up. Conversely, if you aren't an expert and have nothing to offer on any of these issues, it's best to be quiet and make room for the experts to be heard. We have to work too hard to find the expertise because there's so much noise over the top that adds no value and makes no contribution to the conversation at all. So there's just so much noise in the world right now, and a lot of it is being created by people. Not only do they not have any expertise, but they do have big numbers. And guess what? They're making a killing out of this. They're making money. So they're not adding any value, but they're making a fortune. We've got to stop listening to them, because all they're doing is creating panic, fear, outrage, and more. So please stop listening to these people. Stop giving them your time and your eyeballs. Listen to the people that really know what they're talking about. Number 6, reject fear. This is a huge one. Fear is consuming the world at the moment. Any politician, media influencer, or any of those other people, if they are peddling in fear, it's time to switch them off and shut them down. Even in our own lives, no one can make a sensible decision when they're sitting in fear. We all know that. So, when you look at fear and how it's consuming the world, well, then we have a really, really massive challenge on our hands. We need to reject the fear that's ricocheting around the world. Yes, times are tough. Yes, things are shit. But don't live in fear. Really, it serves no one. Not you, not your community, not the world. Fear imprisons all of us. Let's get out of fear. Let's step out of it. And don't listen to people who are peddling in it. Number 7, we've got to reject hate. And this is as equally important as rejecting fear. The people who come from a country that invades another country are not our enemies. Their leaders are responsible. We must stop the hate in our world. It's tearing us apart. Look, it's never going to be perfect, of course, but the escalation of hatred in recent years is really, really, really concerning, and it should be concerning for all of us. We are all hostage to propaganda today. None of us have the only true view of what is going on. But we must not get sucked into this propaganda and start hating and hurting our neighbours. The worst atrocities in our history happened when hate was encouraged to flourish. Don't buy into this. Your fellow human, regardless of their nationality, culture, skin color, religion, or whatever else it is. They are not your enemy. The powers that control war are all of our enemies. Number 8, are you investing in more? Check your investments. And yes, it might be offering great returns right now, but those returns are costing the earth. If we don't recognize this, soon we will lose everything, our money, pensions, and investments included. And number 9, get involved. We are at a stage for humanity where one of the most powerful things you can do is build a movement around something you're passionate about. Equally, we need to be on the streets in the greatest numbers protesting against war and ecocide. We must vote like our future depends on it, because it does. And we also need to support all who need the support around the world, because their needs are great and they are growing. So if you can afford to, please make sure you are donating whatever you can to the causes that you care about, whether it's global, country specific, issue specific, or just supporting the people who are struggling in your local community. And wherever you come from, wealthy country or poor, we're all in the same boat here. There are people suffering and struggling everywhere. Dedicate your resources to helping the people who need it right now. Too many people are struggling. We need to help them. Alrighty, thank you so much for joining me on the business of war. This was actually a really tough topic, and I could have added obviously a lot more information. I always could, but hopefully you have a flavour for war now and the cost to the environment. As I've said throughout this, if we don't have the courage to face up to the issue of scale, there is very little chance that we can overcome. War has always been a terrible part of the human psyche, but today it will destroy any chance that we have at a livable future. I'd love to connect with you, so please follow me on social media. You can see all my handles here, or come and join the Facebook group, 1 Billion People with Uncommon Courage, and let's come together to create a global movement committed to action. 1 billion people acting and driving change can create the human tipping point we need. Once we reach 1 billion people, we only need each person to recruit 3 to 4 people each, and then we will have enough people to be in a position to drive the runaway changes required. We also have to believe we can do it, and then we all need to get to work. So see you for the next one, where we are going to discuss technology and e-waste, which is also another big topic. I've got 3 more to go. Unfortunately, they're all big topics. So I'll see you soon as I can pull that one all together. Bye. Uncommon